In the aftermath of 9/11, Americans discovered that they had a new enemy. A new enemy not quite as coherent as the Soviet Union and the communists in the days of the Cold War, but an enemy that seemed to offer coherence to American foreign policy. The enemy was terrorism or terrorists. And there were certain terrorist groups in particular that allowed American policy to focus. In the wake of 9/11, it was discovered that the attack was perpetrated by a group called Al-Qaeda, whose mastermind was a man named Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden was a Saudi Arabian national who was connected to a wealthy family in Saudi Arabia, but who had fallen out with the official line of the Saudi government and had come to see the United States as the evil force in the Middle East. And Osama bin Laden organized Al-Qaeda to purge the Middle East, and especially the holy regions, the regions holy to Islam, of American influence. And this is what prompted the attacks on 9/11. Americans, quite naturally, wanted to do something to capture, to punish Osama bin Laden and to destroy Al-Qaeda. Because Al-Qaeda had trained, the Al-Qaeda commandos had trained for their operation in Afghanistan, and because Osama bin Laden was thought to be in Afghanistan at the time of the attack, American military forces invaded Afghanistan not long after the attacks of 9/11. The point was to capture Osama bin Laden, bring him to justice, and to destroy Al-Qaeda. So American forces went in, and there was almost no objection, certainly within the United States, to what was seen as a reprisal raid and a reprisal operation. And the thinking was, the hope was, that this would be a quick in and out, get the guy and bring him to justice, and that would be that. Perhaps take measures to make sure that Afghanistan not again become a base for terrorist operations against the United States, but nothing like a long-term sort of remake the country operation. So the troops go in, and it appears fairly early on during the final months and weeks of 2001 that they're closing in on Osama bin Laden. He seems to be in a particular corner of the country, and Americans are hoping to make the capture. But they finally close in, they finally close out all avenues of escape and discover that Osama bin Laden is not there. He has escaped. How did he escape? Did he have secret outlets to the caves where he had had his headquarters? Was he tipped off by Afghanis loyal to him and opposed to the United States? Were there people who were nominally cooperating with the United States who were on the Al-Qaeda payroll? It was unclear, and Osama bin Laden essentially disappeared. And he remained out of sight and on the run for, well, what would turn out to be 10 years, nearly. Meanwhile, though, the United States finds itself in Afghanistan. The goal had been to capture Osama bin Laden, to destroy the Al-Qaeda commando camps in Afghanistan. But it turned out to be a job easier proposed than accomplished, in no small part because the government, the governing group in Afghanistan, consisted of people almost as opposed to the United States as Osama bin Laden himself was. The ruling group in Afghanistan at the time was a party called the Taliban. Now, the Taliban were Islamic fundamentalists who wanted to impose their conservative, narrow, traditional view of Islam as law upon Afghanistan. There was a time in the history of the Taliban, or more precisely in the history of the people who became members of the Taliban, that they were thought to be allies, or at least instruments or agents of the United States. This part of the story goes back to the very late 1970s and most of the 1980s, when the United States had assisted Afghans who were willing to fight against the Soviet Union. This group called themselves the Mujahideen. These are the ones who are basically Afghan nationalists who are going to fight to rid Afghanistan of this Soviet invading force. And the United States was quite happy to ally with them, to support them, to send weapons to the Mujahideen, to provide really sort of top-shelf, state-of-the-art anti-aircraft, especially anti-helicopter technology. These were called Stinger missiles, and they were the scourge of the Soviet invading force because in the mountainous regions of Afghanistan, helicopters were how the Soviets got their troops from here to there. And these missiles could be fired from shoulders and could shoot down the helicopters. And it's a bit of an exaggeration, but not that much to say, that American support of the Mujahideen was critical in finally driving the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan. So at that point, this is now in the late 1980s, the United States was basically clasping arms with the Mujahideen and using them to inflict a blow on the Soviet Union. In just a few years more, the Soviet Union is out of existence, and soon after that, almost out of memory of American policymakers. Now, the Mujahideen regroup as the Taliban, and they take control of Afghanistan, and they impose this Islamist view of what life in Afghanistan should be like. And they take a view that considers the United States to be the great Satan. This was the view that was held by Iran during this time by most Islamic fundamentalists. And so they provide safe harbor for Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. And it's in Afghanistan, under the aegis of the Taliban, that Al-Qaeda organizes and prepares its attack, its 9/11 attack against the United States. So, American troops come in, they don't catch Osama bin Laden. They do break up the camps, but everybody's scattered anyway, so that's no big accomplishment. But then the United States government has to decide, well, what do we do now? Do we simply leave the Taliban in power and essentially allow Osama, wherever he might be, and the Al-Qaeda commandos to come back? Well, no, that's not going to work. So American policymakers decide what we need to do is effect regime change. This was the term of art at the time. You overthrow the existing government and put in a new government. And the new government is going to be much more friendly to the United States than the previous government. This is what happens. So the United States essentially installs a new group in Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, and proceeds to try to strengthen, to support, to prop up this government with the idea that Afghanistan will go from being a country dominated by this fundamentalist Islamic interpretation to one that looks more like a liberal democracy of the West. So the notion of interjecting democracy into the Middle East is part of the American plan here. It's a big job. It's a hard job. Afghanistan had never had anything like a functioning democracy for any extended period of time, and there didn't seem to be a great deal of grassroots support for democracy. This is something that American policymakers, Americans who think about foreign policy generally, have had to deal with, have had to ask themselves. So how exportable is democracy? Because democracy is something that took a while to take hold in the United States. The American government in the 1770s was established as a republic, but not a democracy. Okay? A republic is a system of government where people are the source of political power. They are the legitimators of political power. This in contrast to a monarchy, let's say, like the monarchy of King George III of Britain. But in a republic, ordinary people do not necessarily exercise political power. And it took until the 1820s, the 1830s, before democracy took hold in the United States. And when I say took hold, even in the 1830s and 1840s, it was by no means the case that all adults participated actively in democracy in the United States. But the idea the idea that ordinary people could exercise political power really had its teeth in American political culture by the 1820s and 1830s, and it's expanded from there. But it also grew out of centuries of the European Enlightenment and the Renaissance and stuff like this that just hadn't happened in the background of Afghanistan and in much of the rest of the world. So one of the things that American policymakers would talk themselves into over the decades of, well, it goes back to Woodrow Wilson, but into and through the Cold War and into the 1990s and the early 2000s was that in some ways democracy is what all cultures are striving for. Everybody wants to have a government that reflects the will of the people. And maybe in some vague way this is true, but Americans are going to discover, they discover in Afghanistan, they'll discover in Iraq, they continue to discover in places like China, that the appeal of democracy is just not that great for certain peoples who don't share the histories, the background, the traditions of Westerners. Anyway, so what Americans discover is that we can put in a new government in Afghanistan, and this new government will, well, with American support, can continue to keep the Taliban at bay. But that's the best that they can do. So American forces go in and they try to establish this government, and the government can accept American military support. It can accept American economic support. It can take American money. It can bring in American advisors. But it can't win over the population as a whole. Now I say as a whole because there were certainly elements of the Afghan population that liked the new government better than they had liked the government under the Taliban. And they welcomed the new government, and some of them even were happy to see the United States there, American troops there, American civilian officials there. If this was the cost of getting the Taliban out, because the Taliban had been very repressive. They, for the most part, prevented girls and women from being educated, and they didn't give women any kind of equal opportunity in the economy or in the life of the country generally. And for women and for men too, who thought that that was important for women to have more equal opportunities, the new government was a relief. But Afghanistan is a pretty traditional society. And there were a lot of people in Afghanistan who didn't think that those were priorities. And the fact that the new government was in league with these new imperialists, well, this was something that was generally seen as a strike against the new government in Kabul, the capital. And Afghans who looked at their history, they saw a whole tradition of foreign powers coming into Afghanistan and using Afghanistan as a pawn in their competition. And in fact, in the 19th century, when the empires of Britain coming up from India, South Asia, and the empire of Russia coming down from the north, were struggling for control of this crucial part of Asia. There was a term that originated for what was going on. It was called the Great Game. And the Great Game seemed to be this game played by the imperial powers, played out in Afghanistan. And so at one time the British would have control of Afghanistan, and another time the Russians would have control, and sometimes they'd split the area. And the people of Afghanistan were largely pawns in all of this. But with time, the people of Afghanistan had driven out the Russians, they had driven out the British, they had driven out the Russians again, the Soviet invasion after 1979 and into the 1980s. And so there were plenty of people in Afghanistan who believed that the people of Afghanistan once again would drive out these new foreigners. It was in some ways simply another repetition of a nationalist insurgency against a foreign power. And the more assistance that the United States gave to the new regime in Afghanistan, the more the regime seemed to be the puppet of these imperialists. So the war in Afghanistan went on and on. And there appeared to be no end to it. The Taliban would gain ground, American forces would gain ground, the Taliban would give up ground, and so on. The fighting would go back and forth, back and forth. In the United States, American attention shifted, sort of midstream. And I'm going to come to that in the next lecture, I'm going to talk about the American invasion of Iraq starting in 2003. And at that point, American attention moved from Afghanistan, which was really the point, the focus of the original American intervention in this part of the world in the wake of 9/11. And it was closely connected to the role of Afghanistan and the Taliban in allowing al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden, to train for the attacks on the United States. So there was a definite connection between 9/11 and the American military operation in Afghanistan. But over time, that began to diminish, in part because the United States couldn't find Osama bin Laden, and al-Qaeda had sort of scattered to the winds. But maybe more important, the focus of the United States has shifted to Iraq. Again, more on that in the next lecture. But the result of this was that the war in Afghanistan just seemed to go on and on. America poured money into Afghanistan, and the money had some positive effects on shoring up the government, allowing the government to stay in power. But it also had some deleterious effects in, there's really no other word for it, corrupting large parts of Afghan society. So a lot of the people who surrounded the government were people who were simply quite happy to be on the American payroll. And of the billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars eventually, that were poured into Afghanistan, a whole lot of it did not get to the recipients that it was intended for. So the longer American forces were in there, the more they came to be seen as not a liberating force, but an occupying force. And the less popular they became. And the more they supported the government of Afghanistan, the more the government of Afghanistan lost favor in the eyes of the Afghan people. Now I have to point out here that there was never a moment, I can't speak of the Afghan people as all one or all the other, but the Taliban, which was this group, was hated by large numbers of the Afghan people at the time of the American arrival, because it's this minority group that has seized power and imposed its views on the entire country. So there were plenty of people in Afghanistan who were happy to see the Taliban go when the Taliban were driven out of power, not long after the American arrival in the country. But the longer the Americans remain in the country, the more they overstay their welcome, the less welcome they become, and the more the Taliban are able to present themselves as the true defenders of Afghanistan. And so the Taliban gains this vogue simply by virtue of the United States being there. And the government, as the various corrupt elements of the government become apparent and aspects of their corruption become apparent, the government loses favor. So the United States finds itself trying to support this regime that is becoming less and less popular against a group that was once unpopular but is becoming more and more popular precisely because the United States is there. This is in the first decade of the 21st century. There were people, a lot of people in the United States who were old enough, some people who were in government, who remember the American experience in Vietnam. And there were echoes of Vietnam. There were shadows of Vietnam that cast themselves across the landscape almost of Afghanistan, because Americans thought, okay, we are going in and we're propping up this government in Saigon, South Vietnam, that becomes more and more unpopular the longer we stay. And we are giving legitimacy to the insurgency, in the case of Vietnam, to the communists and the allies of the North Vietnam of Ho Chi Minh. So the very effort of the United States to prop up this government, whether in South Vietnam or in Afghanistan, essentially doomed that government, or maybe doomed that government, or made it very difficult for that government to succeed. Now, in the 1960s and 1970s in the United States, the longer the United States was in Vietnam, the more unpopular the war in Vietnam became in the United States and in American politics. This was not the case in Afghanistan. And in fact, the war in Afghanistan became, and well, still is, the longest war in American history. It surpassed in length the war in Vietnam. And one of the reasons that the war in Afghanistan was able to go on so long was that by the 21st century, in fact, long before the beginning of the 21st century, the United States had moved from an army that included large numbers of draftees, of conscripts, to an all-volunteer army. And in the case of the all-volunteer army, this meant that people who didn't want to be in the army weren't in the army. Now, at the beginning, when American forces went into Afghanistan, 2001, there were a lot of people who were in the army, in the other military service, who hadn't anticipated actually going to war. They had signed up for the military because it was a way of getting training, it was a job, it was a career. But they really didn't expect to go to war, and they weren't hungry to go to war. They found themselves at war. And for some this was, well, it certainly was a change of expectations. It was maybe a bit of a jolt. But this is what they had signed up for, so this is what they would do. But after the United States had been in Afghanistan for 5 years, 6 years, going on a decade, then it was the case that everybody in Afghanistan, all the American military forces in Afghanistan, had signed on knowing that this was part of the job. And because this was the case, they weren't especially complaining about being there. This was their job. They get combat pay. And this as a career soldier, this is what you do. And precisely because no one was made to go to Afghanistan who hadn't volunteered for it, there were no, well, for example, no college students who were worried that if the war in Afghanistan is still going on, by the time I graduate from college, I'm going to get drafted and sent off to Afghanistan. That was the situation in Vietnam. This is one of the reasons that the college campuses were focuses of anti-war protests in the 1960s and early 1970s, because of the fact that there was this draft. No draft by the 21st century. And so the war in Afghanistan went on and on. It cost money, but money is money. It's not reluctant soldiers. It's not lots of casualties among people who didn't sign up. Now, in fact, the technology of war had changed by the 21st century so that casualty rates, certainly among Americans, were much lower than they had been. And among people who got wounded, let's say Americans who got wounded, many fewer of them died because they could get whisked off to very good medical attention. So the number of dead coming home from Afghanistan were minuscule compared to the number of dead that came home from Vietnam. And if you go back to Korea and World War II, of a very tiny part. And they were there because it was part of their job. I mean, it's not to underestimate their patriotism, but it wasn't something that they were being compelled to do. The consequence of all this is that the war in Afghanistan seemed able to go on and on and on. A critical moment came in 2011, when, after a long manhunt, American forces finally caught up with Osama bin Laden. He had been hiding out in Pakistan for some while. Nobody quite knew how long, but that's where American intelligence services discovered that he was. And the president, by this time Barack Obama, gave the order to go in and capture Osama bin Laden if possible, but if taking him alive wasn't possible, to kill him. And the raid ended up with the death of Osama bin Laden. So this is in 2011. So 10 years after, American forces go into Afghanistan to get Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden has been got. And it would have been possible for the United States to say, okay, mission accomplished, and to pull out of Afghanistan. The trouble was that the United States had propped up this government in Afghanistan, and for Americans to pull out almost certainly would hand the country over to the Taliban. And the Taliban would have even more incentive than before to go after the United States. So the fear was that if there was a government in Afghanistan that was friendly to the Islamic fundamentalists, to the ones who were declaring jihad, a struggle, a holy war against the West, against the United States, then what had happened in New York and Washington on 9/11 would happen again. So the thinking was, in fact, there was a fairly well-articulated philosophy of this policy that said we either fight the terrorists abroad, as in Afghanistan, or we fight them in the United States. And it's a lot easier, it's safer to fight them over there, where soldiers are doing the fighting, rather than suffer another terrorist attack. So the result of this was that the United States gradually drew down its forces in Afghanistan, but no American president, not George W. Bush, the one who sent the American troops there, not Barack Obama through his 8 years in office, and not Donald Trump during his first 3 years in office, managed to sort of screw up the nerve, the decisiveness to say, okay, enough is enough. Because almost everybody realized that as soon as American forces leave, maybe not as soon as, but shortly after American forces leave, the Taliban is going to come in and take over the country once again. It will be, maybe, because now we're talking future tense, it would certainly appear to be a blow to American prestige. The United States had been fighting against the Taliban for, well, going on 20 years, and had kept them at bay, but Americans leave, and then the Taliban come and take over. To some interpretations, it would be Vietnam all over again. And Vietnam is something that still was etched in the brains of American policymakers. Among the American public generally, not such a big deal, but still, it would, and so here's where it gets to be particularly difficult for political leaders in a democracy. If the United States were a monarchy or a dictatorship, this wouldn't actually come into effect in such a direct way. But you see what I'm talking about here. For an American president to say, we're pulling American troops out, with the knowledge that this means that the Taliban are going to come in and take over power once again, it would seem to imply that president, whoever the president is, would be saying to the surviving family members, the loved ones, the friends of Americans who had lost their lives in Afghanistan, those lives were lost in vain. This is something that elected officials in a democracy are really reluctant to do because, for quite understandable reasons, it upsets a lot of people. And in sort of the political competition, it sets you up for criticism. You sort of gave up on something. You lost American credibility and you didn't stand up for what Americans believed in. Now, by the 2010s, there were very few people around who remembered from personal experience the attacks that Harry Truman came under for having, I'll put it in quotes again, for having lost China to the communists. Well, the communists weren't a problem in the 2010s, but potential terrorists and people who supported terrorists were. So the terrorists, in the first two decades of the 21st century for the United States were sort of the equivalent of communists during the Cold War. And Harry Truman had been beaten about the head by Republicans and other critics for having lost China to the communists. Well, whatever president pulled the plug on America's effort in Afghanistan, assuming that it was followed by a Taliban reconquest of Afghanistan, would almost certainly come in for that kind of criticism. And so, as of the midpoint of 2020, American troops remain in Afghanistan. They're not doing as much fighting as they once were, but they're still there. America's longest war, the war in Afghanistan from 2001 to 2020 and counting, still goes on.